Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Looks like someone already hit record. That's good.
Hi, Mike. Good afternoon.
Hey, good afternoon. So let me get my slides ready here. Hi, Dr. Harris. Thanks for joining. Good to see you. And Zara, and also Les. Excellent. And let me, like I said, turn on my slide sharing technology. And I think I should keep the tradition of introducing or starting out the recording for the webinar with one of my favorite Otis Redding songs. So let me pull that up real quick. And I always have to get past the advertisement that comes on. But all right, here we go. Let's see. Share screen. And where is my Otis Redding track? It's not there. All right. Let's share. Share sound. Of course, this will get the recording flagged as a copyright violation, but that's all right. We're not generating ad revenue from this, but I do like to set the vibe. So not everyone knows this Otis Redding song, but you know, when people go present at a conference, they have like a walk-up track, right, that they play when they're coming onto stage. This is the one that I would select, you know, for my walk-up track. It's such an iconic sound and voice, and the lyric gets to it right away. You know, I want security.
So, Mike, when you walk on stage, do you dance to this?
Oh, yeah. Got to have a little spring in your step. All right, so I'll fade that out, and we'll get ready to get started here. So let's see, stop share, switch over to the deck. Let's see. Maybe hide my bookmarks real quick before I do that. Although my bookmarks don't disclose too much about my work. Alrighty, so here we are, and thank you ever for joining, and for those of you watching the recording at a later point in time, thank you for dialing in to check out this session that we have for you. So my name is Mike Wilkes. I am the Director of Cybersecurity Operations for the Security Agency, and I know many of you on the call, but some of you I don't, so I'll tell a little bit about myself. But before I do that, I wanted to give Juan a chance to introduce himself and to welcome everyone to today's webinar.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Yeah, my name is Juan Viguera. I'm based in Seattle, Washington, and I'm a member of the founding team of the security agency with Jessica Johnson. And we hope you like this event as well as all the upcoming events, you know, that we plan to put together for you.
Excellent. So we're a fresh organization, but we come from a lineage, provenance, I guess you could say, that is quite distinguished, and that is the Johnson Security Bureau, which is 60 years now, I believe, right, Jessica?
This year makes 62.
Excellent. And this is a family-run, and Jessica is the CEO, and we're building a cybersecurity practice to complement what has been and is a thriving physical security operations and business based in the Bronx. And so I'm honored to extend, you know, that tradition and avoidance of harm, right? If you think about it, what is the durable need for security officers and information security? It's to stop bad things from happening through prevention, through response, through training. And so one of the things that we're doing with the security agency is hosting every month, or maybe even sometimes twice a month, a webinar talking about a particular topic. And so for this month, for today's, we want to talk about the power of transformative and benefits of security programs as directed towards institutions of higher education. And in particular, talking about some of the process and tooling and resources constraints that are faced in higher education, and the ones that are even heavier and even more difficult to overcome for HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. So I want to have, we've got some great folks that have decided to help me with this presentation today on the call to talk about it and make it an open discussion. So it's not a one-way street of me blabbing at you about what I think about security, but I will do a little of that. And like I said, we want to identify some of the challenges. We want to look at some of the best practices. How do we actually engineer and build in cyber resilience for higher education to withstand the attacks? Build a curriculum that they can use to teach and train defenders, and engage with their local communities as well. And so that's where we get to the case study on Stillman that'll come up in a little bit. So real quick, I like to explain the imagery. I used a website called playgroundai.com, and I gave it the prompt, higher education library reading room with indirect recessed ceiling lighting shown at night with oval windows depicting a distant cityscape of high-rise buildings. So who wouldn't want to go and hang out in this reading room, right, if this was a university or college somewhere? So a little bit about myself, in case you haven't met me or heard me speak before. So I've been doing this for 30 years, meaning abusing computers for a living, working, building the internet, building e-commerce websites. And the last 6 or 7 years, I've focused on security roles. But I was, a member, class of 1990, graduated from University of Wisconsin-Madison with a degree in philosophy. And then I went to Stanford and I got a master's in philosophy. And so you might think, well, what does philosophy have to do with cybersecurity? Well, hopefully you'll see the value of that a little bit later. But that was my background. And so I went to work for a Department of Education think tank for the U.S. Department of Education in San Francisco for the Far Western Laboratory. And I was responsible for California, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah K through 12 public education, distance learning education programs, model technology schools, and grants and programs back then. And this was before the internet and the World Wide Web really took off. So I was actually running what's called a Gopher server back then, which ran on port 70. And so along came the World Wide Web and everything went to hell, right? But the fun part about Gopher, it was just files and folders, right? There was no WYSIWYG, there was no chance for malware or ransomware. It was just files and folders. Anyway, a little bit about the history there. I also launched Starbucks back in 1998. I ran the team that gave them their first website. I launched the PlayStation 2 for the PlayStation.com in 2000. Wrote a book for Cisco Press in 2002 for a certification that doesn't exist anymore. Created some banks when I moved to Europe, Rabobank, Direct Banks, which is a Dutch banking, institution. And also ING. I've done lots of different work on both sides of the Atlantic, have worked in lots of different media and entertainment, as well as financial services. One of my previous titles always encourages people to smile and laugh, is that when I was the head of security for Marvel, I like to joke it was my job to keep Iron Man safe. And so if you saw Endgame or Infinity War, you know what happened after I left. I was not there to keep Iron Man safe anymore. But I've also been teaching at NYU for the last 4 years, 5 years, and I've created courses there. I'm a member of the World Economic Forum. I was nominated as a technology pioneer in 2020, working on oil and gas industry, critical infrastructure, modern resilience, and guidance on how to protect that. And also was recently asked to join the quantum security working group for the World Economic Forum. So we publish white papers and case studies on things we can do to help avoid, like I said, bad things happening. Let's see, I also ran the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Enterprise Server Platform, which is about 10,000 servers and a quadrillion contracts traded, based here in New York with headquarters in Chicago. And that's about it for some of my stuff and some of my background. So here's the agenda that I wanted to run through with you all today. And the first part, of course, is to identify some of the challenges, and some of them that are specific to higher education and to HBCUs in particular. And then I wanted to focus on resilience and talk about robust, fault-tolerant infrastructure and how do we conceptualize resilience to make sure that we're not just afraid of being attacked, but we're actually almost embracing failure at a point where we're confident that we've architected robust, trustworthy systems that can stand back up, right? Because it's not, if you've heard the mantra before, it's not a matter of if you will be breached, it's when, and maybe how often. So if you think about not breach likelihood, you can think about breach cadence. So T-Mobile, unfortunately, seems to be getting breached every 6 months. Okta got breached, 3 times last year, although technically it wasn't their fault. It was their third parties that they were relying on that got compromised and breached that caused them grief. And then we're going to talk about a case study, or actually, solutions that have worked, or some of the things that have been available to help us in this battle, because it is very asymmetric, right? The attackers only have to beat us once. And as defenders, we have to win all the time. And so we have to think about different solutions that have worked, different sources of funding, different kinds of partnerships. Then I want to talk about this case study of Stillman College and their cybersecurity clinic, and Dr. Kevin Harris on the call to help us with that as well. So thank you for joining. And then next steps, what does the TSA want to propose to help with this problem? And so here, my image credit, this one came from canva.com, and I just typed in security chaos engineering experiment showing sparks. And so these are generative AI images to help provide some background for these things. So one of the things I guess I would start with before moving to the first slide after the agenda here, some of our risk management frameworks themselves, I think, are holding us back. I think they are actually starting to show their age. I remember being audited, and working with a certification for FedRAMP for Security Scorecard, which is a company that I was the CISO for a couple of years, and I'm an advisor there now. And they asked the question, do you encrypt your offsite tape backups? And the question is kind of a loaded question, right? Because if you say yes, that means you have tapes and you have offsite tapes and you encrypt them. And we didn't, right? Because we were cloud native, cloud first company. And you couldn't say no, because then it would flag it for the auditors. They'd say, well, how come you don't encrypt them? It's like, well, you're assuming that I have them in the first place. So a modern cloud first, cloud native company is going to be using cloud infrastructure and do asynchronous replication of their data and storage out of region. They're not going to be writing it out to a tape drive and then shipping it off to Iron Mountain. So I think that that's just an example of some of the challenges where the actual measuring stick that we're using for security and compliance and maturity is starting to show its age. And some of these things may be divergent. The things that you want to do to protect your company or your higher education institution from bad things happening could actually be in violation of compliance requirements. And so I think we need to think a little bit critically about how compliance does not equal security. I often think if you focus on building a good security program, you pick up compliance along the way. But a lot of folks just sort of go for the minimum amount of effort so they can go home at night and watch TV and not worry about security. And so they're just trying to check the box, and they just want to satisfy the minimum requirements of compliance. And I think that's a real shame, because I think a lot of bad things happen when people just focus on checking the box on compliance and not really thinking about the goal and outcomes for good security programs. All right, so this first piece, identifying our challenges. So higher education has some particular dimensions of risk that are slightly different than the average organization. Oftentimes they have very large networks, meaning thousands of IP addresses have been allocated, CIDR block network ranges, for shared workstations, lab environments, all sorts of things. So they have a really big digital footprint. Then, of course, there's the use of lots of end-of-life hardware and software. Now, that's also true in private sector, right? Not just academia. But it's really bad in education, because the budgets and the profits are challenging, and so they don't have the luxury of like a financial services firm that could refresh its servers every 3 to 5 years. And so you have some servers that have been in play supporting these universities, and higher institution for 10, 15 years or more sometimes, and those things often can't be patched or updated because they're end of life. End of life software as well. They keep using it, they don't have to pay for it anymore. That's the challenge. Then, of course, there's this concept of decentralized procurement. So when I started teaching at NYU, I would have students in my class and we'd do a project. One summer, I had 102 students, all of them cyber fellows, meaning returning adult students that work in the industry that want to get a master's degree to level up and become a CISO or get that title or get a pay increase. And so I had, on average, maybe 4 years of experience per student. So that's 400 years of infosec talent in my summer semester. And what we did was we divided the group into teams of 10. And I had each one of these teams do a security assessment for NYU and to have a real world pragmatic target, right? So one of them looked at the alumni relations infrastructure, the alumni network, because they have a lot of payment card industry information, PCI and PII, personally identifiable information. Another one looked at the makerspace over in Brooklyn, Tandon. And another one looked at, the hospital, right, at Langon. And so it was really useful to not have a hypothetical project, right? Imagine Acme Widget Corporation design a 3-tiered network infrastructure for the cloud or something, right? That's just purely academic and hypothetical. Instead, we did actual security assessments. And one of the things I realized is that every college and department within NYU has its own procurement. There's no centralized procurement. And that causes a huge risk in terms of diversity of solutions, non-ability to have them be integrated and aware of each other. And so you have this decentralized procurement function, which I think gives rise to a lot of systemic risk. Then, of course, you have tenured faculty playing as systems administrators. And of course, they can't be fired. And they're like, of course, I'm going to open up my MySQL server port 3306 to the internet, because that way the students can access it. Well, also, the threat actors can access it as well. And so, and they can pick your pocket and steal your large language model training data sets, for example, which is definitely the case with some of the scans and analysis that my students did. So I think we have to worry about, these professors that think that they're system administrators. And of course, there's limited budgets. Private sector, you see maybe 5-10% of an IT budget is allocated for security. Higher education, closer to maybe 2% or less. And then, of course, there's the overworked staff. Staffing ratios in higher education are maybe 2,000 to 1, meaning 2,000 students and endpoints to every one security person. Compare that with the private sector, it's more like 100 to 1. Where you might have a 400-person company, and you're going to generally have about 4 IT or infosec people that handle security. So anyway, that's a big challenge. But guess what? It gets even worse if you add the HBCU dimension to the higher education. You have slow networks, aka you don't have something like Columbia University with an amazing infrastructure and backbone, and provider and budget, for all of their projects to build next generation technology and have labs and things like that, or NYU. Sometimes they have no network, and so they're actually just using wireless off of the basic like community type infrastructure, or even radio networks, LG or 5G, LTE. And so I think that's one of the other sort of worsening effects. And then, of course, talking at the end of life, we're talking like Windows XP and Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008. You also have reduced buying power because they have smaller budgets than some of the larger, more well-funded universities. And you might have mobile phones. You might not even have laptops and workstations in the student population. And so you have a completely different use case in terms of form factor and types of tools and apps that you can have. And there's this element that I researched, the slide notes, which has a link to the article. There's a high turnover among HBCU presidents. And so that requires or creates a challenge that has to do with consistency, right, of programming, and to stick with something that might take 2 or 3 years to implement, right, like a network upgrade or a redesign. And so I think that's another challenge. Relatively small endowments, which we'll talk about on the next slide. And then, of course, overworked staff see all of the above, right, because you have all the stuff of a regular, predominantly white type institutions, and then you have to deal with the challenges of HBCUs. To make that point pretty clearly and pretty stark, A couple of years ago, I was researching, looking at a virtual CISO role at an HBCU, and I realized and found this little bit of endowment graphing. So if you take like the 100 to 107 HBCUs, I think maybe there's 105 at the moment. A couple of them went under in the last couple of years. 105 HBCUs, you combine all of their endowments, and they have just over $5 billion. Harvard has $54 billion. That's just one institution right now. Now, I checked Google this week. Harvard's endowment has actually dropped to like $50 billion. Oh, poor Harvard, they lost in 1 year or so more money than all of these 100 other colleges have in their endowments, maybe due to bad investments. Maybe they had to pay some extra upgrade costs and things like that out of it. But anyway, so I have some stats that point to the fact that there were some good growth in 2021, at least. Endowments for HBCUs grew by like almost $1 billion. And part of that was due to Mackenzie Scott, the ex-wife of Jeff Bezos, who gave $400 million herself, and then inspired others to give money as well. So anyway, that's one of the things that's been a positive point, at least in the last couple of years, for those endowments, because a lot of these universities can now actually create an investment fund and spend the interest and let the money sit around, generating money for them. The other thing I wanted to mention, just some of the systemic barriers that stop innovation from being as widespread as it could be. So I think about technical debt and technical tax. So if you've heard of the term technical debt, it's mostly like an early decision that was made in the company or institution's history. And it's a pay me now or pay me later kind of decision. And so they say, oh, well, let's just go with this monolithic, what would be a database? Trying to remember the name. It's some kind of NoSQL, database that might be used early on in the building out of a company or in the university. Maybe they have some just big Microsoft SQL server, and it turns out that wasn't the best decision. And so it's technical debt. You kind of have to unwind that decision and migrate to like a distributed architecture and have microservices, for example. So that's considered your classic definition of technical debt. But I think there's another element called technical tax, which is something that slows down or causes friction on every single transaction. So think about your software development lifecycle, the SDLC. When you're developing software, you develop it in a sandbox, it goes to a dev server, goes to QA, and then it reaches production, right, and UAT. And it sort of progresses along this release street. Now, if you're in a business or in a university that only has a few maintenance windows, like when I worked at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, we had 52 change windows a year, once a week. Take away a few for holidays and for end of quarter when you don't want to be making changes. And you have very few chances to upgrade and make changes to the infrastructure. And so I think of that as a technical tax, right? Because it slows down everything you do, not just decisions that have been made in the past that might have to be unwound. So I think a lot of these startups and a lot of organizations are disadvantaged because they have to get something started, and it could be a bad foundational choice. So anyway, those are some of the technical tax to innovation. I think about some of my time at Marvel is a lot of times you'd have a vendor that's already papered, meaning there's an MSA on file, Master Services Agreement. And I would try to get some new technology brought into Marvel, and I had to go through legal at Disney, right? Because Disney bought Marvel in 2009. And so I had to go through the Empire, right? And I had to go through legal review, and they were like, well, you have to have the company sign this indemnification, and liability clauses, which would basically bankrupt any innovative young startup company. So I think of that as like an innovation tax as well, where you can't bring on the newest, coolest technology because getting that paperwork signed is an extra barrier that a fresh startup has, with a really cool technology maybe, versus going with like IBM, right, or going with Oracle, right, on the back end, where they have this paper, this MSA that was written years ago. And so a lot of times companies don't repaper or re-up, the MSA on these agreements. And so I think that forces people to just think within a limited set of solutions and to think incrementally. And so that's one of the bullets here, incrementalism. People don't think wide sweeping changes. How do I just pave over this whole thing and start fresh? And so they think, oh, we'll just tinker and tweak things and hopefully it gets better. And so that stops us from being able to make what I think of radical change and transformation. ChatGPT, for example, is one of those tests, I think, for companies and universities. You have to embrace and adapt, or you shun it and you ban it, right? And so some companies and some countries have tried to block and ban, large language models and access to ChatGPT. Just this morning, I was on a symposium for NYU where we're talking about how to teach, using generative technology and generative AI, and embrace these tools. And don't think of it like the mathematicians in the 1960s and 70s with the advent of the electronic calculator. And like, oh no, no one's not going to know how to do math anymore. And it was like, no, you just don't have to do the boring stuff, right? Just like when the abacus came out, people were like, oh no, people aren't going to be able to do math in their head anymore because they're going to use an abacus. The abacus was also met with that kind of resistance to new ways of doing technology and math and calculations. Anyway, so that's a little bit of a perspective. And then the last piece is cognitive risk. So this is manifested, I think, in like too big to fail. If you talk about the financial services industry, Goldman Sachs and other types of things, bad things that happened in 2008 with the economic crisis. And we have certain questions that we're just not comfortable even thinking about asking. And those are some of the systemic barriers as well, right? So how do we rethink the whole education thing? Because COVID and lockdown, it turned every university into the University of Phoenix online, right? Harvard, MIT, Stanford, they were all doing Zoom classes, right? And what was the big difference between, learning physics or chemistry or biology from, University of Phoenix online over Zoom versus, MIT or Harvard? Maybe the professors are a little better, but a lot of the curriculum is generally going to be the same. So anyway, I think there's some radical forces that we can get at if we think about the cognitive risks and some of the biases that we have. And then for the image here, if you've heard of it, you've probably seen these motivational posters, that tell you, keep trying, and there's like a cat hanging, and it's like, hang in there, it's a little kitten. Well, I find the opposite even more motivational. So if you go to despair.com, you can find anti-motivation posters like this one, which says tasks, by doing just a little bit every day, you can get gradually let the job completely overwhelm you. And so I think that's a little bit about what I'm talking about with systemic barriers to innovation. All right, so focus on resilience. The Biden executive order that came out in May of 2021 around critical infrastructure did not even include the word resilience, right? And it was like, 8,000 words or something, which means that there's a cognitive bias here going on around what does it mean to be resilient and how do we do cybersecurity? So what is resilience? Sometimes it's defined as an object's ability to return to a normal shape after being subjected to force or extreme conditions. This is kind of like an engineering definition, right? It has to do with like tensile strength and ductile properties. Like if you crush a can of Coke and then you infuse it with air or some type of other type of object, you can restore the can of Coke to its previous shape. Also, Aesop's fable, which is my imagery here. When the wind blows, the mighty oak falls over and the willow, which is flexible, survives. And so I think there's this idea that resilience is in, the willow, right? And that the mighty oak tree is not resilient because it does fall prey to, these extreme forces. And so one of my first impressions was to think about this definition and maybe how we can come up with something better that's more attuned to the ecology and psychology definition of the concept, where it has less concern to do with returning to a former state than to adapt and cope and be transformed by these extreme conditions. And so I think of cyber resilience as being like this, old Chinese proverb as well, right? A tree that is unbending is easily broken. Originally occupied, I think it was also in the Tao Te Ching as well, with commentary that the hard and strong will fall and the soft and weak will overcome. But that fable has been used for different messages over time. But I think the main thing is that we need to embrace something that might be called anti-fragile. So if you've ever heard of a book by Nicholas Taleb, that's the title of the book. And he talks about how bones, human bones, for example, are actually strengthened when they're subjected to stress. And so how do we build systems that actually get stronger when they're attacked? Because the point of business continuity planning and disaster recovery, you don't necessarily want to go back to the way your system was the day before it got breached. Why? Because it was vulnerable that day. That's the whole reason it got breached, right? So you want to move on. You want to go forward. You want to get better and to learn from these attacks and to understand, the nature of resilience. So what does a focus on resilience give us? Well, number one, we have to assume breach. Any good security professional is going to have to assume that the threat actors are already on your infrastructure. They can buy credentials on the dark web. They can hack into a person's phone, with 0 clicks. So really, you can't have this perimeter-based approach to security and defending our infrastructure. You have to embrace failure and to not fear it. If you think about it, I think it was Benjamin Franklin that had this quote. It's a very early meme, I guess, from the 1700s. An ounce of prevention is equal to a pound of cure. So I'm going to be giving a presentation in Miami next Friday for the ISAC South Florida conference. And I'll be talking about a pound of cure and talking about failure and how we need to, like I said, find better indicators of resilience and not just fear getting breached. You have to learn how to stand back up and you have to practice your incident response. So you need to look for indicators of robustness, adaptability, and the ability to transform and to become better. Just like I said, in ecology, you don't think of a forest in a forest fire as going back to the way it was before the fire. It gets transformed and evolved, on a larger time scale by the actual destruction of it. So we need to cast off the shackles of mindless adherence to the ritual of compliance. That's what I put in my slide notes. Like I said, everyone's welcome to a copy of them, so you don't have to worry about taking screenshots. I'll happily give you a QR code at the end, and you can send me an email to talk about and look at some of the hyperlinks and some of the notes that I wrote for these slides. But anyway, so this resilience concept, like I said, is much less concerned with the former state prior to the breach or the threat, and more about adapting and coping with these extreme conditions. So here, having been the security officer, the head of security at Security Scorecard for a few years, we have these ratings, right? So we Nmap scan all of IPv4, all IP addresses that are publicly routable, and we do that every week. When I joined Scorecard in 2020, we saw about 20 to 30 billion vulnerabilities across all of the IP space. Now, in a given week of scanning, we see 230 billion vulnerabilities. So the world's getting worse in terms of configuration management and more vulnerabilities. So I took 7 HBCUs here, Howard, Spelman, Hampton, Morehouse Medical College, Xavier, and Clark Atlanta. And I just threw up their scorecards and looked at some of the common areas where security is weak, right? There's 10 factors that we use in scoring, giving people a letter grade. This is the way you talk to management, right? You need to have high-level Duplo blocks kind of summary of risk. Howard University, according to some of my research at the time, was leading the endowments among the HBCUs with about $712 million available, followed by Spelman with about 377 million. So immediately you're talking almost half the money on the next level down. But having a lot of money doesn't mean you have good security. So you can see that there's some universities in here that have a much smaller budget, much smaller endowment, and yet they have a good security posture. And so I think having an A doesn't necessarily equate that you won't be breached. FireEye was breached by APT 29, with the SolarWinds attack, where they were able to embed, their backdoor software into the monitoring software from SolarWinds. It just means if you have an A, it just means that the bad actors are going to have to try harder to compromise your environment, and they may focus on someone else, right, that has a lower score, more risk, available, visible. So that's basically gamifying this whole security business a little bit. I just throw this up here to show, like I said, to make the point that money does not equate to good security. All right, so what kind of solutions have worked? Here I'd like to run through this list real quick and then ask Zara to talk a little bit about the first one. So the National Science Foundation Scholarship for Service. So let me throw up the next slide. So basically they have something called the Cyber Corps, which is part of the US government Office of Personnel Management. And they're funding opportunities for people to study and work in government, and you get your college paid for. So if you do 2 or 3 years of study on this scholarship for service opportunity and grant, then you work for that number of years for the government afterwards. And it's a good win-win situation because a lot of people are looking for work after they graduate. And so this kind of guarantees you a job. And you might be working for state, local government, federal government, MITRE, other organizations. Then EDA, the Economic Development Administration, they have something now called the Good Jobs Challenge. And again, I have a hyperlink in here you can check out. They've funded, I think, $3 billion as a part of the Rescue America plan for the Biden administration, which allocated about $32 million to this idea of apprenticeships. And so there's the possibility now to get an internship that you pay the intern and they get free cybersecurity training. So let's say you're transitioning into the field, you've never done anything in cybersecurity before. Maybe you were a manager at a Publix grocery store or something, but you think you might enjoy this and you think you might be good at it. So you can get like a 400-hour, 9-month training course paid for free, as long as somebody is going to hire you as an internship through this grant, which is through Thrive DX, and Prenti is called the company that got that grant from the Good Jobs Challenge. Then you have the REN ISAC, the Research and Education Network. So not enough universities are a member of the ISAC. These information sharing and analysis centers are a great way for us to raise our collective resilience. College Board, they're having an annual HBCU conference here in New York coming up. You can attend that and get resources and figure out what they're doing to help with the skills shortage and training. Salesforce is involved in the World Economic Forum in bridging the cyber skills gap on a global level. And so they're doing initiatives they've been a part of as well, because there's just not enough people around to defend against the bad actors. Microsoft has their BAM scholarships as well. And I think, let me see if I can open that one up real quick. Yeah, Blacks at Microsoft scholarships. So this was 50 scholarships totaling 137. So it's not millions of dollars, but it is at least one of the opportunities that has worked, and some of these organizations and companies are paying to help improve the access to cybersecurity education and training and give people careers in this area. IBM has a quantum center case study they're working on, and Amazon has something called a landing zone accelerator, which helps universities build their first cloud footprint. So think of it as like $5,000, $10,000 worth of Amazon bucks that you can play around with and learn how to get your first workloads running in the cloud. And so it's sort of like a starter kit for them. Obviously, Amazon's going to make money on the down low later on that, because you're going to start using their stuff and you'll start actually paying for it. But the idea is that you should take advantage of some of these free offers and make sure you know about them at your university. But here I would ask if Zara would mind coming off mute. This is the slide I put together that describes the Scholarship for Service, the NSF grant. You don't apply for this grant yourself. You have to go to a university that has applied for it, and they have specific requirements. But like I said, it's undergraduate, master's, or PhD, and you work in a government position afterwards. And so having gone through that program, I'd love to hear a little bit of a description of it and why you think it's a great recipe for partnership.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. So hi, everyone. I'm Zara Ahmed Post. I'll just give you a little bit about myself. I'm currently a security data scientist at DigitalOcean. I also teach at the University of Arizona, and I run a cybersecurity research lab called Z Collective. And yeah, I went through this program at the University of Arizona. And it's, like, at a high level, it is a scholarship opportunity, but it's not just tuition. It's also really supportive of the holistic student experience. So I'm going to drop a link really quickly that outlines everything that this scholarship entails, which also includes stipends, which I think is a really critically needed part of a student experience. So the stipend is there so that students can really just focus on their academic curriculum and research if it is a research institution. So an undergraduate stipend for Scholarship for Service is $25,000 per year. And for a graduate student, it's $34,000 per year. So this means that students don't have to work in addition to taking their courses and studying. So I think it's a huge equalizer in that way. There's also travel grants, there's technology grants, things like that. So you can purchase a computer that gets you through your coursework. You can travel to DC. There's annual virtual and in-person job fairs in Washington, DC for Scholarship for Service students. So that's a piece of it as well. And yes, you also need to, in exchange for this program, for the scholarship, perform, I'm sorry, you need to work in government in some capacity, as a cybersecurity analyst or engineer. So that government service can look like working directly for a federal agency. You could work for one of the Department of Energy national labs, so Los Alamos, Sandia. A smaller percentage of scholarship service students go to those national labs. When I graduated, MITRE was still an option for service. It's no longer an option. And yeah, so there's a lot of options for students after they graduate. And then I also just wanted to drop one quick link about the participating academic institutions. There's a scholarship for service program, I think in, let's see, 42 states. So, it's available across the US. There's a lot of really great institutions, public universities that are participating in this. To become a participating institution in scholarship for service, like that academic institution itself liaises with the National Science Foundation in order to bring in this funding. So students don't need to do any additional, liaising with the NSF or with OPM. They just work directly with the institution. So that also removes a barrier of complexity for getting this funding. Yeah, if there's any questions about that, definitely let me know. And also, I'll put my email in the chat if you have any questions, or if you'd like to follow up about this program. I'm happy to keep talking about it. So, thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming to the webinar and sharing your direct personal experience of this particular scholarship and solution that works clearly. DigitalOcean, for those that don't know it, is a New York based organization that is a cloud service provider. It's more of a niche or boutique, compared to like the market share of Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. But it's awesome. I've been a fan of the work that DigitalOcean is doing, and you're doing some really cool research into Kubernetes and security and how to secure these crazy Kubernetes instances where everything runs as root over port 80, right?
We're doing our best.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. So we have one more slide that I put together with a little bit of a drill down from that previous list, which is the Economic Development Administration Good Jobs Challenge. So I talked about this already. There are 32 states and territories focusing on a bunch of industries, 829 commitments from employers to hire interns and to get them the free training through Thrive DX. I used to teach what was called HackerU, the curriculum. And so this is former Israeli Defense Forces curriculum that was put together, Unit 8200, if you're familiar with that kind of nomenclature from there. And basically a lot of Israeli startups are incubated in the military, and then they finish their service, and then they found a startup. And so that's why you have this technology kind of culture in Israel, as well as other places like California and also here in New York, for example. But it's aiming to place more than 50,000 workers into good quality jobs, and to focus on some of these intro level positions. So it's a paid cybersecurity training for interns. So you pay the intern, and then they pay for their training to come up. And it's I think maybe $20,000 kind of course material. Like I said, 9-month, 400 hours, lots of hands-on labs, which is really important, I think, to not just have book learning, right, and academic in the not so healthy sense, I guess, learning about things. You don't want to just read books and say, okay, now I understand Active Directory. No, you actually want to build an Active Directory server, and you want to run it in the cloud, and you want to attack it, and you want to defend it and simulate, this kinds of stuff. That's how you get familiar with defending critical infrastructure and IT from the bad actors. So I have a link to the EDA Gov website. I can put those links into the chat as well, just so that you don't have to wait until you ask for a copy of the slides later to view them. So if I put them in now, they're part of the recording. Cool. So this next piece, Exceptional philanthropists, right? So this is the Mackenzie Scott story. She gave 17 HBCUs, between $4 and $50 million, $400 million in total, which is amazing. I think she just sold a couple of her Amazon shares, right? I forget what her net worth is these days, but there's some folks that I've been working with in different programs that have been recipients of this. One of which was. Pictured here, which is Morgan State University. This is President David Wilson and Donna Howard, Vice President for Institutional Advancement. This photo was captured the day that her gift was made public in December of 2020. And the funny story here, of course, is when they got the email, they're like, this looks like a phishing email, right? It's like, hey, you've been awarded, all this money, click here. And of course, they had to make some phone calls and stuff to figure out, no, this is legit. This is actually happening. And so here they are, laughing, smiling, and celebrating the fact that a really good philanthropic effort, was led by Mackenzie Scott, and her ability to distribute wealth, in great places where it's needed, because there's a lot of talent that's being trained and graduating and getting, undergraduate and graduate degrees from these universities. And like you said, or like I saw, or like I showed you, there's a huge disparate amount of money available for them to run their programs. The other piece, and this is the case study, and this is what I want Dr. Harris to tell us a little bit about in a second. I went here in New York to the Aspen Institute Cybersecurity Summit last fall, and it was a great program with lots of incredible leaders on stage talking about different programs that they've worked in, what's working, what's not. You had folks from the FBI, you had folks from CISA talking about it, you had the director from the SEC talking about the new requirements and regulatory oversight for publicly traded companies. And thankfully, he didn't get booed off the stage, right? Because a lot of people in the security space are a little bit concerned about what the SEC is doing by going after the CISO, the head of security at SolarWinds, and bringing a fraud case against him, because we think that's unfair. But I won't talk about that too much. But what was interesting here was that there was a 2017 attack, ransomware attack, and Dr. Warwick was on stage talking about this. And that's where I got this idea to have this webinar and to think that we could focus on some of these programs. Because what they did, she experienced the attack and the tech and the steps that they took to after the breach to improve and just basically rebuild from scratch. A lot of the systems actually didn't get ransomware because they were so old and fragile that they just fell over, and so the ransomware couldn't even run on it, right? And so that's what we're talking about. Some of the older infrastructure is actually a defense in some ways, right, against some of these modern attacks. But they did get, I think it was a demand for $10,000 in Bitcoin, and the message came over their ERP system, so the hackers were on the inside, like I said, assumed breach, but they had no real IT or infosec to deal with it and the requisite skills. So what she did, she said she called her daughter to help figure out what to do next, right, and to contact the FBI and the Department of Education, and Veterans Affairs, and things like that. So there's a YouTube link from the Aspen Summit. I'll throw that into the chat for you all right now as well, where she describes what happened. And like I said, this was the sort of genesis for me wanting to focus on this and talk a little bit about the consortium of cybersecurity clinics. Because what they did was they actually took this moment of failure and turned it into a strength. And they built this program, which is Stillman College's program. And I'd love to have Dr. Harris talk about it. But I've seen a lot more focus on this now. And I hadn't actually known about this previously. Even Google now, their CEO, Sundar, has seen the intelligence of this approach, right? Because we have clinics for health and we have clinics for law, right? And people that can't afford good healthcare or lawyers can get clinical access, from these clinics, and it's community-based, local community of practice. And so they've invested $20 million, Google has, in supporting the consortium. And so there's a Forbes magazine article talking about this that talks about how the cyber attack actually led to creating this new bit of innovation. So let me hand over the mic, as it were, virtually, to Dr. Kevin Harris, who runs the program at Stillman now.
Yeah, thanks for having us, and thanks for highlighting some of the work that our students are doing and that we've done. And as you said, the cybersecurity clinic is similar to, like, we're familiar with the healthcare space or the legal space, to where law students might work pro bono on cases. And so the cybersecurity clinic is based off of that model, to where students are going to go out and help different organizations become more cyber aware and cyber secure. And kind of has been mentioned previously in the call by others, cybersecurity landscape needs to be collaborative, but also at the same time, some of the challenges that are there for students that are transitioning from higher ed into the workforce. Sometimes we look at that first entry level job requirement of 1 to 3 years of previous experience, which is difficult to obtain, if you're waiting until you graduate. So that's one of the key areas that the cybersecurity clinic focuses on, is the experiential learning piece. So students are going out and engaging and doing real life work. So they're applying what they're learning in the classroom with the real client, and that also brings, a lot of times we talk about the other skills, soft skills or critical skills, whatever you may call them, that they've got to learn to interact with the client, explain technical terms in a business manner. And so they learn that, but also it's a way for the institution and for students to give some goodwill to the community, to support the community that they're in by offering these services. A lot of time they're the smaller organizations or nonprofits or maybe local governments to say, okay, these are services that maybe you aren't aware of that you should be providing your employees, if it's cybersecurity training, or maybe if it's extremely small business, they can't afford to offer cybersecurity training. And so the organizations receive this training from the students for free. There's no cost to the organizations there. So it's a way that students can feel good about what they're learning. As we know, the more secure every organization is, it strengthens the cybersecurity landscape, because a lot of the attacks that we see now will kind of expand exponentially. So one organization will be infected, and then they'll use that to reach out to their third-party clients or vendors that they work with to infect those. So the stronger we can make any one or multiple organizations, we're strengthening the cybersecurity landscape. And then also being part of the consortium of cybersecurity clinic, which is schools across the nation that have these similar models. And when I say similar model, is every institution is different that has a clinic, ranging from what type of organizations they provide support to, what departments, or even if their clinic operates at a undergraduate or graduate level. Is it completely student ran, or is it a faculty led clinic? And so there's different varieties of it, but all with this same common goal of providing free community support in the cybersecurity clinic. And so it's one of the ways that we look to provide students this extra experience while they're going through their academic program. So just wanted to share a little bit about that. And as part of the consortium of cybersecurity clinic, institutions can be at any level thinking of starting a clinic, have just started a clinic, has had an established clinic, and then as a consortium, we share best practices and ideas and kind of help navigate the landscape together. So just encourage if you're listening to this or here, to go out and look at the Consortium of Cybersecurity Clinic's website. And if you're not a member, to join. And you don't have to be an existing clinic to join the consortium.
Excellent. Yeah, I remember looking at the list. It was like, universities like MIT and Berkeley, they have programs. So it's not just the ones that are doing it in a scrappy way, so to speak, right? It's also some of the well-funded ones understand the value of this model of bringing the talent to defend the university and then teaching, making it part of your curriculum, because that helps universities attract students and retain them, right? And get them to graduate. Matriculation, right, is one of the main measurements of helping endowments, right? How many of your students come in, how many graduate. And then I think, what was it you said, Dr. Harris, you said that Google spent the first 10 million and the second 10 million of allocation of $1 million each is going to happen in like March?
Yeah, so there's a open call for proposals for institutions that are starting a new clinic. That Google has an additional 10 million, 1 million per institution. That there's a open proposal call that closes, I believe it's March the 1st, that first week of March. So it's definitely still open, and you can get to that. I just dropped the consortium website in the chat, and you can also get to the information about submitting a proposal for the Google funding there as well.
Excellent. Yeah. So hopefully more organizations follow suit, and don't just spend 100,000 or something like IBM was doing, or other companies. So thank you for that. That's really a great story to hear about how you're saving the organizations that are in Stillman's community from not knowing what to do, right? Not having any resources, and it solves a lot of problems. Like I said, this partnership. So I will finish with TSA's commitment to supporting higher education and historically Black colleges and universities. We want to provide access to CISOs for mentoring and support. So we're going to have office hours where me and some of our other talent can just simply take questions. So if you know someone that's in a position to plan a security program and they don't have a CISO, because a lot of organizations don't have a chief information security officer, we can help you figure out how to defend your institutions from attacks. So we commit to doing some office hours, certainly this month and in the future months, to just pro bono provide advice and feedback on questions that people have. Then we want to help create cybersecurity certification programs to complement any existing course offerings, because not everyone is going to get a PhD or a master's degree, right? There's this sort of micro certification wave happening at universities, NYU included, right? One of the classes that I created on threat intelligence and cybersecurity analytics is a 6-week course, part of their 9-month program. And then I also think it's useful to partner with the local Chamber of Commerce to get those HBCU students and other cybersecurity students into a work study situation, working to defend the local communities. And the Chamber of Commerce, like I said, is a great partner that we want to reach out to provide, that tactical experiential education that Dr. Harris talked about. So here I would say, how do we get there? How do we make this a reality? How do we make higher education the ivory tower cyber-wise that it is, sort of knowledge-wise and institutionally? And so here's the QR code I promised, if you'd like a copy of the slides with all the links to the resources, information. For those that are watching this later on a recording, you can reach out to me, M. Wilkes, at securityagencyusa.com. And my LinkedIn profile, feel free to connect with me. I am Eclecticus. It's sort of my handle that I've had over the years. And I think that's it. That's all I had. So with the last minute or two, any questions or comments from the rest of the folks that have dialed in? If we don't have anything, feel free to come off mute. If we don't have any questions from anyone, then I'll thank you for your time and attention today, and look forward to hearing from you. Because resilience, right? I talked about this. This is the collective ability to defend, and if we share information and we share access to resources and best plans and partnerships that really do work and solve this problem, then we can actually have a reduction in the amount of ransomware events. I think we're at like $10 trillion industry for the bad guys right now. How do we fix that, right? How do we make it harder for them to do their nefarious acts?
Mike, if I can add to this conversation, and thanks for the presentation. I wanted to ask Dr. Harris, given that you have these clinics out there, what's the limiting factor to expand them across the states, not just for HBCUs, but in general? And how can companies like TSA support you? Obviously, there are companies like Microsoft and Google that can afford to provide funding, but companies like us have talent that can be very helpful. you might suggest that the hourly, we can provide some hours of training, but what else could we do to help you run a much more efficient, clinic across that you could become a sort of like the best case scenario that we can extrapolate across all the other clinics around the nation?
Yeah, I think one thing, the training piece, but also the mentorship, of just coming in, speaking to students that are part of the clinic and just sharing best practices, and also serving as, a reviewer, for instance, if they're preparing a brief or they're preparing a presentation to give to an organization, to kind of be that first trial run for students to give them feedback. And because sometimes for students, they're learning to take feedback, constructive feedback, and so they just don't hear it from the first time from the client. So I think those are ways there. Of course, finding ways to onboard, if their intern opportunities also are good. But I think, the mentorship and giving feedback are great opportunities.
Yeah, and feel free to make it a program. I mean, yes, we can talk all day long about what could be done, but I like to be very actionable, right? So if you have a path where we can be involved as part of your curriculum development, please let us know, because I want to be part of that growth path. I'd like to make this webinars more actionable. Just it's great to present about ideas, but what's the next step? How do we take it forward? And given that you have this plethora of consortiums or what I would call a way to reach out to the communities, please let us know how and make us part of it, from the get-go. And we'll be committed to supporting you.
Definitely appreciate it. And definitely will reach out. And also, if anybody else is interested, I drop my email in the chat as well.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Great. Well, we'll wrap it up for today. Let people get to their, if they're East Coast, 2:00 plans. And thank you all for your attention. Feel free to share the link. We'll be updating the webpage, which was a registration page. You can still register to watch this later, and more people can watch it and hopefully get involved. I do think the cybersecurity clinics model is something that can take off and reach those goals of hitting every state, right, in the U.S. By 2030, I think was the goal, and just continue spreading this model, because I think it's a really good, powerful partnership between private sector, public sector, and academia. All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Mike.